So, right, configuration management in Drupal. Obviously, we've had various versions of Drupal, and I'll start with a sort of a quick refresher. So I don't know how many of you have heard me give a talk on features in the past. I've done it a few times, so it's probably been seen by a good portion of you. But after that, Drupal 7 methods, we came to Drupal 8, where the configuration management initiative brought us our config code in core. So we now manage all of the configuration with code that's version controlled, deployable, and we don't need the features module. So it is the case that the active configuration is stored in the database. That's primarily performance reasons, but the configuration is exported and imported. So the management of your configuration is through YAML files. And a fairly important point we'll come back to, but the set of exported configuration belongs to the specific site from which it was exported. So the features module, just to come back to that, it does still exist, but actually as the module's own maintainer says, well, actually, please don't use it. You probably don't need it. Oh, excuse me one sec. I've got some people wanting to come in. Sorry, hi to those, the couple have just joined us. I'm basically on the first couple of slides, so you haven't really missed anything at all. You can see the quick summary of Drupal 8 on screen at the moment, I hope. So Rachel, Aaron, just a quick sense check. You can hear me all right?
Yep, I can hear you fine, thanks.
Cool. Excellent. Aaron's mute at the moment, but if one of you fancies checking the text or something he can hear, that'd be great. I will keep going. So yes, sorry, I was just summarizing Drupal 8 and the config and code, and emphasizing that our configuration management is through YAML files, and the active configuration is stored in the database. Now, an important part of the configuration in Drupal 8 is the configuration API. So anything in Drupal that needs to store configuration data will use this. So it's two flavors, config API, which is your singleton, really simple configuration, such as site name, site mail, or an API key, that kind of thing. And configuration API, configuration entity API, which is for multiple sets of configuration. So that's actually used for things like views, vocabularies, fields. Just a quick aside, it's useful to know, is the states API does exist. That is for local variables that are particular to a given instance of a site, not even a site in all its variants, but that's things like the last cron run. So let's just have a wee look at the workflow. And once we've had a look at this, we'll move on to some of the techniques we can use to manage this across our different environments, because that's where it can always get a bit fun. So firstly, is you want to remember to set your config sync directory in your settings.php file. That's the format for Drupal 8.8 and above. There is a slightly different syntax if you're on earlier versions, which you shouldn't be by now. Drupal 7 is permitted, but you shouldn't be on earlier than 8.8 of that major version. And if you don't set that, just so you know, you'll get your config exports placed in site's default files, and then a config underscore and a hash folder, which isn't really where you want to be storing your config. So config sync just above your web root, or sorry, next to your web root is common and probably where you want to put it. You can easily export your updated development site config. So you've installed your development site, you've built a whole pile of things. Drupal config export, that's your Drupal console command, or you can do it through the UI. And of course, you can still use Drush as well. And once you've deployed updated code to another environment, you can then import it. Again, you can do that through the UI, also using Drush or the Drupal console. And we'll take a look at an example of this and the user interface a bit later on. There are a couple of potential gotchas just to keep in mind. Firstly, if there are things where configuration has been changed directly on the live site, which does happen for valid reasons, importing config can, of course, then revert them. So that's one of the key things we'll be looking at in our techniques. And also, I've certainly forgotten to do this when switching back onto another site and updating the code on my development build, is if you forget about running database updates before you import your configuration, you might have a slight chicken and egg situation. Well, less chicken and egg, but more you've done it the wrong way around. Because, of course, if you have a database update that adds extra information, your new configuration may have relied on those being in place. So make sure you composer install, Drupal update, and Drupal config import in that order. So onto the how not to break your live site. Again, just as I go through this next section, it's all very much just on the slides, and then we'll be taking a look at a few examples in a sort of real world, we're building a module use case. So this is the fun one. I'm sure we've all, in some form or another, whether in Drupal 8 or 7 or even earlier versions, had the joy of deploying configuration to a different environment and had some fun with it. The first one is the classic. It's Settings.php Overrides. This still applies. It still works exactly the same sort of way. And personally, I find it particularly powerful for enforcing settings that you mustn't have changed via the UI. And my favorite, personally, is disabling error output on the live site. So even if you've got someone who's got that level of user interface access, they still can't display those errors on the live site. It uses nested array keys for the nested configuration values. So that can be a little bit of a fun one. I'll pull up some examples later on, but it can be a bit fun when you're not used to it, working out what exactly the syntax for a given value is in Drupal 8. And sorry, just a quick comment I didn't make before. This does apply to Drupal 9 as well, but I'm focusing more on Drupal 8 because, well, we're still relatively new in Drupal 9, and I don't know about you all, but most of the sites I'm looking after in Drupal sense is focused on 8 just at the moment. So you can, sorry, coming back to the nested configuration values, it's quite helpful to use the configuration single export user interface, or you can run something like Drupal debug config as a means to help you identify the name for a given config variable. So I will show you some examples of that later on when we look at our module. Another technique we might consider, but I think it's a bit extreme, is read-only configuration. So there is actually a module called config read-only that you can enable in settings.php, having installed the module. And that locks down all config changes on the live site, but it's pretty sort of nuclear. It's a pretty nuclear option, really, I'd say. And I would suggest that sort of an appropriate permissions model to allow people to change configuration that does make sense to change, in combination with some of these other approaches, probably going to be more suitable for you. One I found very useful is this sort of ignoring settings. So you can exclude entire modules configuration. So you might do devel or stage file proxy, that sort of thing. But alongside that, the config ignore module I found particularly useful. So you can use that to block import of specific settings, whether on per setting basis or slightly wider. And in particular, that's quite powerful for something like web forms, which are configuration, but you often have that context that, well, hang on, this is a form builder. We want to be able to edit our forms ourselves. Oh, excuse me, I just admitting someone else. Give me one moment. Let's get them in. Okay, so yes, so if certainly any of you who've done anything with web form in Drupal 8, you'll probably have already come across this, and hopefully haven't had to bash your head against that too much. Now, these techniques so far are quite good for the more general scenarios of, well, I just don't care about those things. But you do have the aspect of, well, what if you really need to be able to do things on environment by environment basis? So this possibly comes into play all the more if you're not working just on your own. I suspect if primarily you're developing something just for yourself, or rather by yourself, you can probably get away quite easily with the sort of previous techniques, because you've got your own local development machine. It's got certain settings on it in the settings overrides and the like, and it doesn't matter about other local development builds and so on, because it's just you. But as soon as you've got a team, you might want to say, well, actually, as a team, on our local development builds, we have devel with these settings, or we have stage file proxy with these settings, etc., etc. And that's where config split can be particularly powerful and useful for you. So what config split does is allows you to take certain parts of the configuration and put them into separate directories in the config sync folder. And you can then, according to your settings, they can be merged with the main sync directory or just left out. And that's where you get into, right, great, we've got our dev settings for these modules that we only have on the dev site, and you know everyone's got that same set of settings. So the basic setup, there's a user interface. I've not gone with screenshots for this one. There are some, it's a fairly straightforward interface, but in the UI, you can say, right, I want to add a new split. You specify a directory. Now, this point's very important. That mustn't be in your main sync directory. So it's got to be alongside it. So for example, you might have config, and then inside that, you might have sync, live, dev, and so on, that sort of thing. So when you do config exports, it'll only export splits that are marked as active. So what is sensible here, and actually necessary, is set active status to align with the needs for your live site. And then you can override in your settings.php for any relevant splits on your local staging and so on. A couple of little bits of terminology worth keeping in mind. If you've used this before, you may have seen the terms blacklist and greylist. These are actually now, I'd say, slightly better described as complete split, which basically says that don't include this in the main sync at all, only include it within the split. But conditional allows you to have some default configuration in the main sync, but where the split overrides it if it exists. So the former complete split would be, say, the devel module settings. You take them out the main sync and only have them in your dev split. Conditional might be more your sort of should error messages be displayed. And then your main sync, of course, says no, but your split on dev can override it to say, yes, show everything with that trace. The actual import-export mechanism is nothing new. Once you've got your splits in place, you can use the exact same Drush or Drupal console commands, or indeed the UI, as you would normally. Although, if you're doing this, you might see only references to the main sync directory. Active split configs do get exported alongside that. Now, just do note that, remember, if you change the status of a split, so for example, in your settings.php, you'll want to rebuild your cache. And equally, if you change the configuration or indeed create a new split, you'll need to do a single import of that split before the full config import in order for those changes to take effect. So the way you, and with that is you can also manually export an inactive split. So that's quite helpful for your, well, I need this dev setting, which isn't active yet, maybe, put it into my code. Now, as I say, I didn't obviously do some screenshots or demos of that particular interface. If you have any questions, we can obviously come back to that. Happy to just pull up some of the existing screenshots out there just to help illustrate that later on if you want. But I think config splits, the main thing with it is it can feel quite daunting before you start using it. But just, I think if you keep those points in mind, you should find actually it's fairly straightforward, really. One other quick comment: if you have used config split in earlier versions of Drupal 8, there were some other commands relevant, so config split import, but those don't actually apply for the latest relevant versions of relevant modules. So the export one does, but the import one apparently doesn't. And the final comment, just before we get on to our module, is what about a reusable configuration? So this is kind of a hark back to our first slide about features in Drupal 7. One of the things we could do with features, of course, was have a library of features that we could use on multiple sites. And you could update the feature and deploy that to multiple sites. If any of you have used a distribution that had features, such as, I know a few of you for sure have used OpenAtrium, you might have had a bit of fun with features overrides and so on. So things get pretty complicated at times. And core Drupal 8 and 9 don't solve that for you. But if you are looking at trying to do this kind of thing, I'm not going to delve into the detail of it, but there are a couple of modules, or in some cases are sort of families in terms of dependencies of what else you need. But config update and config sync are a couple of modules that aim to allow you to update configuration, but without killing deliberate overrides on the site. And of course, in this context, you're talking about updating your local dev machine without killing customizations that you might have made, even things like field level overrides. It does get pretty fiddly. But Thunder or BLT is a couple of examples of distributions do use some of these sorts of techniques. So Thunder, for example, uses config update. And it does work, but yes, it's fiddly. So I hope you're all with me so far, but we're going to start looking at some real-world examples of creating, managing configuration for your custom code. And I think a lot of the stuff so far, if you've been more focused on site building, you've probably done at least some of those techniques, but you might, in a site builder context, not have really had cause to touch custom modules or custom configuration. It's actually pretty straightforward. And what we're going to look at, you could kind of take to a very basic level in terms of just providing a few simple things with some configuration, or you can take it all the way with administrative screens and so on. So a couple of quick comments about default configuration. So any extension can supply default configuration, and you put the YAML file with the configuration in the config install directory for the extension. That could be one single file, or it could be a set of files. And one point to keep in mind, and we'll see some related sorts of things later on in this example, but if you've exported some configuration from your development build such that you then say, oh, I'm going to put that into this module, you need to remove the site-specific UUID from them. So I mentioned in the summary at the beginning that a set of exported configuration belongs to the site from which it's exported. Not the environment, but the site and its set of environments. That is, of course, on the basis that you haven't installed environments separately. You probably wouldn't have got anywhere with your deployments if you'd done that. What you can't do is grab this configuration from one Drupal 8 or site and drop it onto another without removing these UUIDs. You won't be able to import it. And I'll come back to the schema file in a second. So here's what we're going to try doing. Well, we're going to succeed in doing it, actually, to be fair. But we're going to create a module that gives us an embedded Google map with a single pin to mark our office location. We'll give it some default configuration, and we'll also make it editable through a user interface. We'll then think about how we would extend this to add an additional location. And actually, Aaron's going to pick up on this in part 2 in whatever it'll be, a few weeks or a month or so's time. So first things first, we obviously want our module framework. And if you're a Drupal console user, you might know of the Drupal generate command, in this case, Drupal generate module. It just gives you a little wizard to run through, answer a few questions, and we can choose our options to end up with, in this case, our info file, .module file, and a themable template. Of course, I suspect many of you will also use the technique, I need a module, right, I'll just copy the info file, module file, and themable template approach from that other module I built. So that's obviously absolutely fine. First things first, I mentioned briefly the existence of a settings schema. So in your module, oops, sorry, excuse me. In your module, you need this format of schema file. You can actually get away without it if you're just doing simple configuration. And just to refresh, a simple configuration, I mean things like what we're seeing on screen, a Google Maps API key, or a value for zoom, a value for latitude. So yes, you can totally get away without this. What you will get, though, is it's worth implementing it, because if we just go back a couple of slides, actually, here, I mentioned it is used for typecasting as well as translation support. So it's worth doing, and it's very simple. So this is the form we use here. We name our settings. This actually here also starts giving us a clue as to what you might expect to see if you overrode something within your settings.php. So we're going to have a string for our API key, a couple of floats for latitude and longitude, and an integer value for the zoom. Just a quick comment. Yes, of course, we could absolutely be using geocoding and all the rest for selecting where or defining where a pin is, but we're not going to worry about that for the purposes of today. We also need to we can define our default configuration, and hopefully you can see the directory structure okay over here. But in our config install directory, this is where we can drop any of our settings files. And this is the on module install, what settings get provided. So in this case, we'll, just for the purposes of examples, we'll provide the default latitude, longitude, and the zoom value. Obviously, in real world usage, providing a default location for this sort of thing is probably not appropriate. So let's just have a wee look at the next set. So there's our settings. You'll notice, of course, I didn't have a default value for the API key. That's definitely not something you want to lock into your potentially distributed module. Okay, so let's just give you a quick summary of the aspects of where the functionality is coming from. Firstly, we will have a page controller, so that will get our settings values and build out the render array for our page, and it'll also populate settings for our JavaScript. We're going to have a library because we'll have some JavaScript we need to call, and in this case, potentially CSS or the like. We'll have a routing file because we're going to have a page, in fact, 2 pages. We'll have administration and the front-end page. And similarly, we'll have some menu items. And finally, we'll have a settings form, which is handy for the API key. It isn't essential. It's not necessary. So if you're building a little module for your own purposes on a specific site that used settings and it installs with a set of settings, you could simply rely on overriding that if you needed to in settings.php. So it's by no means a mandatory bit of functionality to have a settings form. So let's just have a wee look at the code here. So our controller, what I won't do is dig into things like, extends controller base or all the rest of it. We're focusing very much on the settings here. So the first thing we do when we want to get or start using configuration is we do this. We Drupal config and then give it the name of the configuration. So this is the same as we saw in our settings.yaml file, is Makkaru contact location.settings. Once we've done that, we can get the individual configuration elements within it. Now, actually, you'll see potentially there is a missing address from the schema So I haven't actually provided that in the schema, but you'll see that it will still work. So as I said, you can get away without the schema file, and it's not going to break anything, but it is good to have it. But this will illustrate and demonstrate that, yeah, it still works. We can build out a URL for the directions. We can, so here we've obviously got our values, and then we've used them here. We've got our zoom, and also, as you'll probably be familiar with, is map pins on Google Maps. Unless you're getting into custom pins, which of course you could do, they need a marker color, or rather, we probably don't want the default red marker. So we'll set a Drupal colored marker. We're also, in this particular case, there's an example of pulling out a different bit of configuration. This is just the site-wide sort of system config, and we can get the site name. I'll skim across the render array a wee bit. It's not the focus of the talk, but very happy to come back to it later if any of you wants to delve. And just to mention quickly, this is a way that we can make settings available in our JavaScript. So if you've got things like latitude, longitude, etc., that obviously the JavaScript's going to need access to, that's how you can do it. And then we can just return the build there. So that's our controller set up, and I'm going to skip past the library and touch on routing next, because with the routing, so our module name .routing.yaml, here's where we can say, okay, here is the page. We give the router name, we give it a path, and then we tell it, please use this controller and that method within the controller. Give the page a title, and we can just say permission is access content. Then the menu item, just to say that is, again, we don't have to have a menu item, but for the illustration here, we're going to have, this will be our menu item, and we are telling it what the root name for that menu item is, which menu to put in it, and what the weight is. So when we enable our module in a few moments, we're going to see that page appear, and the main menu item will appear. And the final piece of the puzzle is the library. So firstly, you have this libraries format for defining your CSS JavaScript libraries. Again, if you've not really done anything with that in Drupal 8, happy to come back to that later, but for the purposes of what we're focusing on, you'll see that the one thing I'll emphasize at the moment is, firstly, we're relying on jQuery, and secondly, we're relying on Drupal settings as a dependency there. So these are libraries that we are depending on. You might be thinking, like, hang on a minute, you're loading a JavaScript file there, that's fine. But where's your actual Google Maps JavaScript being loaded? And what we've done there is we've used hook libraries info alter to add the Maps API with the API key on it. There are other ways you could do this. You could have JavaScript load it using the Drupal settings, for example. But just to show you here, we've got hook library info alter. If it's this module, get our configuration, get the Google Maps API key, build up the URL, and now add this Google Maps library as an external source, and async loading and so on, and return libraries. There's an important point to make here, which you'll see when we look at the administration form, which is that this gets cached. So if you change your Google Maps API key, you need to make sure that cache gets invalidated. So we'll touch on that. So depending on what you're comfortable with and so on, there are other ways in which you might look at doing that, such as loading it through the JavaScript itself. Finally, then, we'll take this quick look at our configuration form. Again, I'm not going to get into all the nuances of the form itself, but what we will focus on firstly, I'm setting this, these are the settings we want. This is just fulfilling the contract for what we're extending. Again, don't worry if that's doesn't make particular sense at the moment. I'm happy to sort of dig in a bit more later for anyone who wishes. The main meat of it, what we're looking at here is the build form here. We're getting our configuration. We're building our form fields. So this is just standard form API stuff here. But we are, of course, setting any default values for these form fields using existing configuration values rather. And the other important part is that we need to handle the submission of the form and set these configuration values that we've just updated. So there's a few things we've done. We've set which configuration we're updating. We then set each of the variable keys with its value, and then we save. And the other thing here is we're going to invalidate the library info tag, and that is what tells Drupal, oh, hang on a minute, this thing here will need to be regenerated, reloaded. And that will make sure that your map will then be able to show with the API key that you've changed it to. So what we should expect to see, if I just click over to our page not found, so this is our path that we've set. So of course there is no page, it doesn't exist. If we just install the module, so Drupal module install Makkaru contact location, you can of course do this through the user interface as ever. Just let that take a moment. So one of the things here is, because it will install, is not that we've set the Google Maps API key in our default, but if we had, for any reason, because the module install obviously rebuilds the cache, it would update things for us. Give me a moment, or give my laptop just a moment here. Right, let's install it. A bit slower than normal, but that's live demos for you. Rebuilding caches, there we go. So what we'll expect to see now here is, if I refresh our contact page, we should get our map attempt to load, but it shouldn't load properly because we don't have an API key. And if I go to the path for our settings form, just reload that, excuse me, you'll see here, right, no API key. So let's give it one, save configuration. One thing you might notice is what you would actually want to do as well within your form is just have a nice confirmation message. We haven't got that, but it has saved. And if we reload this, we now have our map loading and we can interact with it and click on it. So there's our site name that we used. And I'll come back to the JavaScript in a wee bit just to complete the loop for the Drupal settings. You can see here the get directions link that we've built up as well. So that's our basic module in place, and with some settings. And if we add one of the optional fields here, maybe even change the zoom, we can then refresh. We can now see the address comes through here and onto our little info bubble as well. Now, the other thing we've got is we've now got a module that's got configuration beyond what we've got for just the default values. Now, if we wanted to deploy this, we can export from our development site. And just to illustrate a couple of aspects here, you can run your sort of config export command on the command line and export it to your sync folder. You can do a full archive, which gives you a zipped archive of all the configuration files, or you can actually even export a single item here. So if I come down and find our settings here, you can see I've got the existing ones there, but I also now have these other two bits of configuration. Now, if we were to export this, I'm going to mimic this slightly. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to put it into an empty configuration file I had ready. Also, when you enable modules, you have the core.extension.yaml lists all your enabled modules. So we're going to enable it there. Now the point here is that if we are on our synchronization screen, of course at the moment there are nothing to import. We haven't made any changes. But let's just disable our module, or uninstall, to be fair. Remembering Drupal 8 is uninstall, not disable, and then uninstall. Incidentally, there's if you're using the minimal sort of bar with the sort of devel extensions in your toolbar, you can actually get a handy reinstall module interface. But in this case, we don't actually want to reinstall. What we want to do is just uninstall it and sort of mimic what would happen if we deployed the code to another site where it's not yet enabled and has no configuration. So now we're in an uninstalled situation, but in my sync directory, I do have the configuration sitting there as we want it. So if I refresh this, you'll see a couple of things. I'll come back to the warning message in a second, but we'll see one new set of settings, and we'll see one that has been changed. So if we view the difference for core.extension, we can understand from that, right, okay, our active configuration. So just remembering that active configuration is, yeah, it's active, it's what's in play, that's what's in your database. Staged configuration is what it's found in your config sync folder that hasn't been imported. So it's found that we've added this module. And similarly, obviously this one, because it's a brand new file as a whole, it'll say file added and with these settings. Just to sort of highlight this warning message here, that might be a little confusing because you'd be thinking, well, hang on, why might that be lost? That warning, in part, that's a slight red herring because I'm fiddling around on the same build rather than actually having deployed it to another one. But if you do see this, it doesn't mean it's guaranteed. Normally, you would see that if you were deployed something to the live site, but someone had actually changed some configuration on that live site that you potentially about to override and blat. So do pay attention to it, but in this case, we don't need to worry about it at all. So just to demonstrate, this is disabled. This will not work. We will get page not found on these admin and front end. When I import everything, again, I can do this on the command line with Drupal Console or Drush. And indeed, of course, if you're looking at deployments and you've got a nice scripted deployment, yes, your deployment can then obviously then trigger your console or Drush command for you. So it's just finishing up, and what we'd expect to see afterwards is great. There are no configuration changes to import. We're expecting to see something that's fully in sync with our config sync directory. So there we go. And because the module itself was listed as one of the enabled modules in our configuration, we now have it enabled. The difference here is that you've seen it's gone straight away. It's got all our configuration. It's got our address, it's got our API key and everything as we wanted it. So that's your basics of workflow, not just for creating a module with some configuration, but equally the sort of exporting and deploying to a different site. So there's our configuration that we've just done there. So what happens if we want to add a new setting, a new bit of configuration? So the marker color is an obvious one. Let's allow that to be configurable. So obviously, you don't want to impact existing users, and that includes yourself with your live site. You don't want to deploy something and it breaks your live site until you've added some configuration or corrected it. So what we want to do is update our schema and also the default install settings, or the config. We also want to add an update hook so that we can populate the setting for existing users of the module. We can then use the setting in our controller, and we can also add it to the configuration form. So let's go back to our code. And we will firstly come to the schema. So I've got a handy cut and paste ready here. I'll copy and paste even. So one thing just to note, oops, not as handy as I thought. One thing to note here is that you actually have a special type of called color hex. So if you are doing a color setting, just keep that in mind in your schema. It stands out from your sort of string, float, integer color hex. So yes, it is an actual type. So that's our schema. I lost my mouse pointer. There we go. In our install settings, we're then going to say, well, let's. And you'll notice that I've gone against the grain and used a U in color, despite the fact it's web related. So let's just give it an example. Here is A7. So here's a point just to keep in mind, of course, is we can absolutely use a totally different color as our new default install color. The important thing for us is to say, well, what we don't want to do is have that same color apply for existing users. They're not expecting the color to change. And the way we do an update hook is to put it in the install file. Let's just come to the install. Where's it gone? There we go. Right, I've pre-prepared this one. So update hooks, in case you've not done them before, update followed by a number. And the important thing is that as you go through them, that number will increment. So the next one will be 2 and so on. And what we're doing here is we're saying, look, I need to get the existing settings value. Settings object. I'm now going to set marker color to this value. So this is not the same one that I put in the default install, but it is the same as what we had before in our hard coding. And then I save this. So this will then make sure that we don't break it for anyone else. And when I've saved that is what we'd then expect to see. I'm not actually going to take the time running it, but we'd have our pending database update. We'd run it and it would set that configuration value. The other places we're going to need is we're going to need to use it in our controller. So let's just go back to our controller here, which I seem to have closed the file. Give me a minute. Where's the controller? So here, where's it gone? There we go. There's our marker color. So instead of that, we'll just do this. And that's all we need to do. I haven't shown you the JavaScript side yet, but we will touch on that just for completeness. And finally, we're going to update our configuration form. So firstly, I can't put. See, this is actually a slightly older form with the older array syntax in it, but let's just grab some things from over here. One moment. Save you all the watching that and get rid of these funny paste artifacts. Right. I'm not going to worry about the funny indenting there right now. But here we go. So same principle as before. Text field, here's our title. Get any existing value for it. Use the description. Is it required? Now, in fact, because we are already installed, what will happen there is we won't have a value. So I will actually run our database update. But before I do that and anything else, we'll also want to make sure we have set there we go. So we're going to save that. Let me grab this. So let's just show our pending status report done. Here we go, database updates out of date. So let's run our database update script and hope I've typed everything correctly in there. Again, obviously this sort of thing that can be done on the deploy script as well, and so on. Bear with my machine. Here's our pending update. I haven't actually given it a description, but obviously normally you would give it a nice description so people know what's going on. We'll get there. Remind me to run this on a more powerful machine next time I do a demo. Right, and we can now all breathe the normal sigh of relief when we run database updates and we don't get a big red error message. So what we hopefully will see is if I refresh our settings page, it should pull in our previously hard-coded value. And there we go. There's our previous value. And we refresh this page. It's very subtle, but it is a slightly darker shade, believe it or not. So that is how we can update our module to include an extra setting, while also being sensitive to the needs of any existing or sites or users already using the old mechanism. Now, as sort of touched on before with things like config update, of course, if you're changing more complex things, then it can get more fiddly. As a general rule, you get into the realm of, well, yes, there are certain things you might be able to migrate and update hooks. There may be things that you flag up as, look, you need to change this, that, and the other, or look at this and review it manually. So just thinking sort of more generally, thoughts on the module. How might we do it differently? So firstly, it's really rigid. You know, it's single page, single location. One of the things, and you might already have been wondering about this, is, well, why not make it as a block? So we could create a block plugin and have configuration. We still would have certain things that we set centrally. So the API key, you don't want to configure that on a per block basis. So that's definitely module level configuration. And then maybe even things like your actual specific location coordinates and possibly zoom would be within your block configuration. So that would give us, okay, his multiple blocks around the site, wonderful. But equally, if we wanted multiple pins on a single map, you can imagine that if we start going into our code and duplicating swathes of it to create an extra set of settings for each pin and then chuck it all to the same JavaScript, that's getting really, really unwieldy very quickly. And as I mentioned, the configuration into the API right at the beginning that's where you start moving for your collections of settings. So that will give you a much more powerful approach for that sort of use case. And Aaron's going to look at that in part 2. And just before I move on to questions, I did promise to show you the JavaScript itself, just to help illustrate the use of Drupal settings. So if I pull that open there, all we're doing here is, right, there's our Drupal settings value that we pass through. This is just your standard Google Maps embed code. And this is, indeed, this is pretty much taken off their example page. So nothing particularly novel there. You can set your info bubble information and load up your marker and then open your info window, etc. So that's all very much standard code. The main part of it is simply grabbing Drupal settings variables that we pass through to it using this mechanism in our controller. So, any questions?
I've got a question.
Sorry, yeah. Sorry, I was just catching up on a couple of chat things as well.
Okay, no, that was me that posted. So we have this issue that we've got 7 developers working on one Drupal site.
Yeah.
How do you deal with UUIDs? Occasionally we get errors going, can't import config, UUID doesn't match. And if you're working across.
Right. So what that suggests to me is that at some point multiple people have run a site install.
Okay.
So that would be one. If you're seeing the issue on a real global basis, that would be one way that could happen. Just to put some context there, let's pretend that you have some sort of install mechanism that in the same manner as the module install there is, you could have say a profile that installed stuff.
Yeah.
So let's just take an example that 2 developers use that profile and install the site on their local machine. What they'll end up with is they'll have sites with exactly the same configuration, but different UUIDs. So that would be one way in which, if one of them then exports some configuration and the other tries to use it, is that it'll have the UUID from the other person's site. So
the way we got around that is just for them to get their own UUID and then update the file, but it's not very is that hacky?
Yeah. So what I've tended to do in the past in terms of when people initially set up is in a team context, is that your sort of lead, I mean, it doesn't have to be the lead literally, but your one defined person does a site install such that you've got, right, this is our site that becomes the master site ultimately. And just initially, that first time is when people first start up, is that they take a dump of that database. What you've then got is everyone's running a development environment with exactly the same UUID for the site as a whole. And from then on, any updates you don't need to do by database copying, but rather you can then just do through the configuration. So that's one easy way to sort of get around ending up with different UUIDs. Because the other thing that you're going to get potentially, if you're getting that problem from one developer to another, is that you get into the risk that, well, your production site that you need to deploy the configuration to has probably ended up with a different UUID, or at least it's definitely going to have different UUID from some people. So I suspect you'd then see a deployment that could fail because you've ended up maybe with a UUID that's not what you're hoping for.
Okay.
Does that sound like what you might have been hitting, or is it something slightly different?
No, you're spot on. You're spot on. We started getting lots of UUIDs and developers complaining they couldn't import, and yeah, so that makes sense actually. It makes a lot of sense. Okay.
Yeah. What I haven't had to do, but I'm sure it would be possible, is modify the UUID of an existing site. But I wouldn't be surprised if that's actually relatively straightforward to do. If you were trying to sort of say, well, look, we want to fix this. even if it's not, to be honest, you could say, well, look, let's pick a master one, most likely the live or whatever the most sort of, if it's not truly in production yet, pick one environment, get everyone to take a dump of that database and install it, and export configuration from that, keeping its UUIDs in config sync, and then everyone's on an even keel going forwards.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, because we're all pushing it to a dev environment that everyone's pushing code to, so that makes sense.
Cool.
Okay, and I had one other question, something that's been doing my head in, I hope that's an easy answer. Does anyone know any good tutorials to install Drupal Console? Every time I try and follow tutorials, I just keep getting error messages every time I run it.
I have, do you know what? Sorry, I've just seen Oliver Davies' comment there is that, yes, if you're doing a Drush site install, you can pass it some existing
okay.
stuff.
Cool. Thank you.
That's the so yeah, that's good if you've grabbed an existing site. The one thing I'd just say is a caveat: it depends on the context in which you do that, because if you were grabbing someone else's configuration, such as within the team, and it's the same site, then I'd say great. However, what I would recommend is if it's not the same site as the one you're copying config from, is I would try to avoid using that existing UUID. While you probably won't hit an issue, it does make sense for any given site to have its own literally unique UUID. If you see the distinction I'm getting at there.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
But that's quite a good way if you're looking at, well, we've got an existing setup and other members of the team are then installing, and you don't want to do the grab a database. So that's a very nice point. Thanks, Holly.
No, thanks for that.
And override options.
One thing, if you don't mind me coming in as well, because one thing you might find is over time, if it, and I'll touch on this actually in the part 2, but every entity has its own unique UUID as well. So when people start creating, especially when it comes to config, when you start creating more config entities, you could run into situations where if for instance people don't have they don't have they've started from different installs, one developer creates some config and exports that, and someone else tries to import it with those UUIDs, and you get a conflict there as well. So as Bryan was saying, as long as everyone's starting from the same place, you're probably fine. But it's worth just noting that also each entity will have its own unique IDs.
Okay. No, thanks, Adam. Thanks. Yeah, I can see where we've went wrong. We've been running 2 projects for the last 6 weeks, with 7 developers working on each. So it's been interesting. We're there, but I can see how the UID issues came about.
Yeah, I think it's one of those kind of gotchas when you first hit it, or otherwise hear about it as like, oh yeah. So yeah, that's no, I'm glad that's sorted. Figured that out for you. So
but yeah, as I was saying, so I mean, I don't know if it's my machine, but I'm just really having real problems installing Drupal Console.
Yes, sorry. It's interesting actually, because I was running some Drupal trainings quite a while back now, but there were some people having some issues with that. I'd have to refresh my memory on precisely what issue they were having. What I'm actually using is on my own machine there. You may have noticed in the commands, it's not all I use, but in this instance, this demo site is running on Lando, which, as having that, but Drupal Console is literally just a composer requirement. But I think typically the sorts of issues we were seeing was where people were trying to install it more natively on, the sort of the Mac or the like, because I think, and this is it's a while back, so this might not be quite it, but I think, as I recall, it was something along the lines of conflict between things that were supposed to be installed globally.
Yeah. So there is a tutorial that's install global, and I'm sure I did that, and then it started causing me all sorts of issues. So
yeah, I'll see if I'll do a quick search back in my notes to see if I can find the information and drop you a line on that.
Or do you think just switch to Lando?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd certainly recommend using some form of VM. So the other thing I'm using, so I've got Lando for quite a few things, but I'm also for a set of stuff using Drupal VM with sort of Vagrant and VMware.
So what would you recommend? I mean, we were using Docker for a few months, and it was just causing us a headache, and the machines were overheating, and so we just ripped it out, and we're using localhost just now just to get us by.
Yeah, I think Lando's Docker based, so if you've been having issues with Docker, it might not help, but it's worth a try. It's so quick to install, but I've equally had some good experience with Drupal VM, and I've personally found it's not that you can't customize things in Lando, you absolutely can. I've done all sorts of things with that. Sorry, Dan Pickering's made a good comment about there's an issue with console the maintainers tweeted about, so you might be in that. The Drupal VM is quite powerful if you need to do something really custom in terms of what your dev environment has to have.
Right.
Again, you can do that with Lando, so I have installed extras on it, but I've got some really quite unusual requirements for a couple of things, and Drupal VMs work really well for that, along with some custom sort of provision things. If it's fairly straightforward site, I'd definitely say Lando's worth a shot, but see how, give it a go. And if you still have the sort of Docker, like, fans gone crazy or whatever, then
yeah, and just because we're working at, it's not just one user, we've got 8 users, more that will try to get against the same setup.
Yeah, well, that is nice and easy with Lando. You just have a config file in the so literally just .lando.yaml in the root of your project, and then you can say, all right, use Nginx, use this version of PHP, and the rest just kind of comes. So I'd definitely say it's worth a try. I mean, there's a couple of comments in the chat mentioning DDEV and things, that the various tools, but I gotta say, in terms of ease of setup, when I've run training and needed to do sort of something more than just the basics, Lando's worked really well for just getting people up and running. But so there you go.
Oh, thanks. I'll have a look at all 3 of them. So DDEV is not Drupal based, that's just an external, because it does for PHP, WordPress, Drupal. Okay, I'll have a look at that as well.
Yeah. I've not used that one myself, but yeah, if you do still have issues on, say, Lando or DDEV that seem to be just actually you're getting problems with Docker on your machines, which I've had in the past. It's why I've only fairly recently come back to Lando. I just had performance issues, like, I don't know, we're going back a year or 2 now, but yeah, I'd say try them first and then try Drupal VM.
Cool. No, thanks.
Cool. Sorry, just seeing the override options module issue mentioned there, as to anyone fancies reviewing it. Any other questions on the config stuff?
I have a quick question. How would you manage multi-site configuration? Would you do that with config split?
Yeah, so you can definitely do splits. It is one of the examples they give, actually, the sort of config split for that type of thing. So essentially, what you're looking at there is the realm of any, because obviously they're separate databases. Any given site, you can have different active configuration splits. Sorry, you can have different active splits. So from that point of view, I think that would be a good option to look at. I've not done sort of multi-site in a literal sense for a while. I've tended to do more shared, site, the equivalent of sites all, and then totally different environments with their own sets of config. But yeah, that would be well worth looking at config split for that. I don't know if there's anyone here who does more with multi-site who can chime in there.
Cool. Cheers, Brian. That was helpful.
I think that was a no to anyone else having the. Okay. Well, I think it sounds like that's probably it for the questions. So there we go. Thank you very much. Great. Well, unless anyone else has anything, I think that's that. And let me just open this issue, this override node options link as well. We're going to get a pile of people reviewing that now, aren't we?
If anybody wants to revisit this talk, we should have this. I believe a recording. We should have the recording up on the Drupal Scotland YouTube channel fairly soon as well. If anybody wants to revisit the talk, and of course part 2 coming soon as well.
Excellent, great. Well, thank you all, and have a nice evening.
Yeah, see you later.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
See you then. Bye now.